Hi guys and welcome back to Is It Worth It reviews. Today we are going to talk about a tube headphone amplifier xDuoo TA-26s. What this S means and why should you choose this amp or tubes in general. Stay with me and let's find out together. So if you maybe follow my channel regularly or just hi-fi regularly, you probably already know that TA-26 released some time ago, and I reviewed that one. It was a single-ended only amplifier, and it sounded really good. Now TA-26s, when you look at it from the outside, it has one difference. There is added 4.4 millimeters balanced output, and the switch that was in that same place is now located in the back of the unit. So we still have one set of RCA single-ended input, one set of RCA single-ended output, so you can use this one as a preamp basically. In the front we have good old 6.35 millimeters single-ended out, and this added new one, 4.4 balanced output. Aside from that, everything else is the same. It's still very hefty and chunky unit, so I will not be holding it in my hands that much. It still uses two tubes, and I'll put those on the screen because I cannot remember all those numbers. I'm getting old, people. Now, I cannot tell you the brand of these tubes because they do have some markings on them, but I'm not familiar with these and they do not say any brand to me. But trying new tubes and seeing how they influence the sound, the overall tonality, the sound stage, etc. is part of the fun for most people using tube gear. So I leave that to you because every review of a tube amp or preamp or something like that would stretch to infinity if I started changing and just testing different tubes and explaining all of those differences. So today I'll focus on default factory tubes, which are quite good because the sound in this default state is quite good. But just before we talk about the sound, let's quickly go through the specs, which are basically exactly the same as the previous TA-26 version. That means 500 milliwatts of power. This also means that this head amp is specified to be used with 60 to 600 ohms impedance headphones. And why not less than 60? Well, it's because this is an OTL amp, meaning that you do not have output transformer. There is no impedance lowering on the output, and because of that, if you connect low impedance headphones, they will produce, most probably, a noticeable distortion in the sound. And I here have to say something that I've personally experienced. Even though you should not do that, of course I did for the purpose of testing, so you don't have to. I first tried some of my planars, like Gold Planar GL2000s, and yeah, distortion was very noticeable. I do not recommend you do that. But for example, I was surprised that when I tried my AKG K702, which are 62 ohms, which is just on the border of 60 ohms that this amp is supposed to work well with. At first, like first half an hour to maybe 1 hour, everything sounded great. But then distortion slowly started to creep in, and it wouldn't go away. And I'm not sure why at the beginning I could not notice any distortion, everything worked well, but later on it was there, it was quite obvious, and I don't think that this head amp is actually usable with these AKG's K702. That is a pairing I simply wouldn't do because the distortion, especially in the bass region, was quite noticeable. So if you decide to go with this one, be aware that, in my opinion, you should definitely have headphones that are at least 100-150 ohms or higher. I know that most of you looking at this review already know this about OTL tube amps, but I don't know, maybe there are newbies watching this channel, and if there are, welcome to the show and this craziness. But just beware that this is a head amp for high impedance headphones. And I wouldn't even risk it if you only have something that's close to the limit that's specified, like these AKGs, because they did not work well with this amp. Beyerdynamics, the T880 250 ohms, for example, worked great. That was no problem. And that leads me to, when everything is paired correctly and properly, how does this amp actually sound? Does it have that stereotypically tubey sound? No, actually it doesn't. It is on a slightly warmer side, and it's not as analytical and fully linear as some solid-state head amps, but it's not overly warm by any means, and it doesn't sweeten the sound too much. Well, it does in some sense, but I'll get to that later. I was now talking in terms of tonality. Tonality is quite neutral to my ears and in my opinion. So we have a bass line that's full, that's punchy, which is not always the case with affordable tube head amps, which this one is, and it has very nice grip. So bass line is quite controlled, and you can definitely hear texture. You can hear the way that bass was produced. It's not the same if you produce a bass note by synthesizer or by a string on a bass guitar or double bass or something like that. All of that has their own character and different vibrations and textures, and you can clearly and easily hear that. So it is like revealing grippy, nice bass line. And then also for the mid bass and the mid range, they have a little bit of warmth. They have that tube bloom a little bit, but it doesn't deter too much from something that we call neutral and perceive as neutral. And I think that highs also play a significant role there, because highs are well extended and they do have a little bit of, you know, smoothness and sweetness of tubes. But when needed, they can also be aggressive. So if there's like a violent cymbal hit or something like that, it will come crushing. It's not that overly tame and sweet kind of sound that's always padding everything. So tonality-wise, I would call this quite neutral with a touch of warmth and sweetness, especially in the mid-range and the mid-bass. But then, what is that tube character? Why would you buy this one that's only for high impedance headphones? It's just not as versatile as some good modern solid state amp that can be paired with everything from like 8 ohm planars and in-ears to the highest impedances. Well, it is because of that signature tube sound that so far I have never heard a solid state head amp sounding like this, no matter what kind of tuning they make, or if you use like filters on your DAC, your source. I think that the secret is in how they resolve details in terms of time domain. Tubes, for some reason, sound very continuous. I think that most people call this smooth, and I agree, but I also wanted to add this phrase continuous, because, I don't know, for some reason, that feels like a better adjective to this sound than smooth. Because smooth can mean a lot of things, like not being aggressive dynamically, having like really mild highs. But I'm here talking about time domain. And everything just sounds so well connected and liquidy. Tones have a flow to them. And to me, that's that continuity where nothing ever feels choppy and sudden and jagged, if you know what I mean. So a small analogy here that I wanted to use, I don't know if you're like a very, very weird man like I am that likes watching ice skating. But I do. I like ice skating, and my favorite discipline is ice dancing that's in pairs. And if you watch any pair doing ice dancing on the ice, you're probably going to be amazed how every single element is connected to the other one by such a smooth motion and smooth transition between two. So if you watch like a sports ice skating, it doesn't matter if it's singles or pairs. Singles are worse. They're all like being explosive and jumping and showing you technically what they can do. I can jump high, I can spin 4 times, I can land. But in the process, while pushing themselves to the limits, they sometimes, actually quite often, look strained. They perform particular motions, but in between they're just preparing for the next explosion, for the next jump, while these ice skating pairs, they do all of these transitions so smooth and so seamlessly. It's simply continuous flow. It's not a stack of things happening. It's all those things joined together in a smooth, liquidy, continuous flow. Okay, ice skating analogy over. That's what's happening with good OTL tube amp like TA-26s. When you listen to the music, everything that happens, even if it has some sort of sharpness and edge to it, then you move to something a little bit milder and slower. All of that feels so smooth. It goes up, it slowly goes down, it moves up again. It's just so liquidy, smooth, flowy, and continuous. The way that solid-state amps cannot do. They're attacking you, they have more dynamics, higher resolution, but for some reason, when directly compared to a tube amp like this one, it feels a little bit digital. A little bit one thing, another thing, another thing, another thing. Without that good of a connection and transition between those elements. And that can be very seductive, especially in songs like this one, for example. This is like a country-like song. It reminds me a lot on Simon and Garfunkel. It just has soul, and it sounds absolutely great through tube amp. Those guitars, that vocal, everything sounds so natural and smooth, and there's flow, and you're just sucked into the music. But that probably opens the question, then what kind of music and what genres is where this kind of tube amp will actually let me down? If you listen to it in isolation, there are no such genres. You will not notice a lack of resolution or lack of dynamics. This is a pretty capable amp. And it has enough power when paired with high impedance headphones. It has enough juice and grunt, and everything sounds pretty darn good. But to actually notice if it has some shortcomings anywhere with any sort of music, you actually have to compare it directly to a little bit different head amp. And that leads me to the comparison with Topping L70. Why this one? Well, it's because at this price point, around $300 where TA-26s is, this is probably my favorite head amp. It is a solid state, it is topping, but don't make a mistake and think that this is topping sound of like 5 years ago. It does not sound analytical, shrill, thin or anything like that. This is actually one of the warmer, fuller bodied sounding head amps at this price that I've ever heard. And it has pretty natural tone timbre, it has good mid-range, full vocals, and I like it. And when you compare these two directly, the interesting thing is that you don't notice much of a difference in terms of tonality. Like bass, mid-range, highs, everything is pretty well balanced with both of these. And maybe I could say that the mid-range, I think especially lower mid-range, where like some sort of fullness and thickness comes from, is a little bit more prominent on TA-26s. And you realize that, yeah, this is actually one of the bolder sounding head amps at this price point, but TA-26 is boldening just a little bit more than this one. Just to show you that I'm a tube amp, I do that, that's my thing. And then you actually much sooner notice these other differences in terms of timing and like dynamics, where TA-26 definitely sounds more liquidy smooth and it has better flow. L70 will sound a little bit drier. Again, not in terms of tonality, it has plenty of bass and mid-bass and full mid-range, but somehow you feel that the sound is not as continuous. It's just a little bit more raspy, if I can say that. And you do not notice that in isolation with L70, but when you compare it directly to this tube amp, you notice it is a little bit dry in the mid-range especially. And then if you listen to a lot of tiny detailing, you'll probably realize that the background is a little bit cleaner and darker with L70. And highs have more micro detailing. And if you observe that technical aspect, you can conclude that L70 is a better head amp. But on the other hand, if you go back to TA-26s, for a moment you stop listening to those technicalities and start listening to just how naturally flowy guitar strings sound. And they do sound naturally flowy in reality. And you listen to male and female vocals, how just connected and liquidy smooth they are, and every tone feels like gliding over a perfectly smooth ice. Okay, me and ice again. I'll stop, I promise. And you go back to L70, you'll notice that everything is just a little bit more mate. The sound is more mate, opposite to glossy and liquidy on TA-26s. And tones, they do glide just nicely, but the ice is just a little bit rougher. Oh no, I promised I'll not use ice analogy again, but here I am. But I think that phrase mate, like you know what's mate finish and what's glossy finish, well, tones sound a little bit more mate through L70 and a little bit more glossy and liquid-like through TA-26. When you compare dynamics, again, L70 is slightly more dynamic and livelier in that sense. And especially if you listen to bass notes, sometimes they're grippier but punchier at the same time. They're just more capable of being explosive and quick, whereas the bass line on TA-26, it's more musical, it has punch, it's vibrant, but because of that flowiness in time domain, where I explained everything happens in a smooth fashion, that means that those quick, dynamic, explosive notes will be slightly softened and not as explosive. What's better between these two? I cannot tell you that. I personally at some points while listening my favorite slow tunes, and I love some sort of country-like, jazz-like female singers, I would definitely choose TA-26s. It just sounds so effortlessly liquid and natural. And tones around us in real life are completely uninterrupted and liquid-like. If you do anything that sounds continuous, any sort of knock on a glass, or just pluck a string on a good acoustic guitar, it will sound effortlessly liquid in real life. And that part of realism, TA-26s is doing better than any solid state at this price point, including L70, that is one of my favorites, if not the favorite head amp at this price point. But then realistic sound is also sometimes very explosive and quick and punchy, and L70 does that sort of being explosive, being very quick to transition from loud to silent and to loud again, and in all of that just reveal every detail and every micro detail and tiny little sharp edge with absolute clarity. That is what L70 does better. And in some cases, some occasions, in songs, for example, like this one, you definitely notice that. You notice that L70 is just more fast-paced and more explosive sounding. And this basically leads me to the conclusion too. Because if your music playlists consist mostly of these kind of really fast-paced, really engaging sounding music, very lively, where rhythm and beat and pace is most important, you'll probably like L70 a little bit better. But if you enjoy more these kind of genres that I personally enjoy the most, my music choices are really wide, but probably most of the times I'm listening to just slow, emotional girls and guys, I'm not discriminating, singing along with the guitar or double bass or something like that. Like Jillian here, I just love her and her slow, country-like tunes. For a music like that, I think that most of you would prefer TA-26s because it will probably make you just close your eyes and melt down with it. If you ask me for that melting down experience, what sort of headphones should I pair with this one, I can only tell you they have to be 100 ohms or higher. Do not worry too much about tonality, in my opinion, because this is fairly neutral sounding amp. It's slightly warmer, but in my mind that's pretty good because most headphones are actually slightly sharper than they should be. Like for example this AKG Case 702 that I mentioned previously. They're very revealing, great sounding headphones, but slightly sharp and edgy, pairs really well with TA-26. Actually better than with most solid-state amps, in my opinion. And same goes for beyerdynamics and for so many headphones that want to impress reviewers and first buyers into having so much detail retrieval and being so open, but they can become a little bit tiring after some time when you listen them on a headphone amp with same sort of open, out there, a forward, edgy kind of sound. So most of headphones out there will pair really, really well with this amp. But even more importantly, even if headphones are a little bit tamer and warmer sounding, it's not a problem because this headphone amp does not deviate much from neutrality. It's plenty open and plenty neutral in my opinion, so the overall tonality will be of the headphones you choose to pair with it. And of the source, it also lets the source, like your DAC or CD player, something like that, that tonality to pass through pretty well. But it does add this tube sound character to everything, that smoothness, that liquidity, just a little bit of note bloom, and it makes everything sounds really nice and smooth and pleasant. And if you are after that, if you want that kind of sound, TA-26s is a really good head amp. And if you by any chance decide that you want to try this one out, please consider using my link down below this video. It will lead you to the Epos Audio store. Nice guys that send this one in for a review. And that way you would also be supporting my work and this channel and everything I do here and this sort of honest impressions, because a small percentage of every purchase goes back to me. And if you decide to do that, I thank you. I also thank my patrons, they're the best. And see you next time. Bye.